Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Deckled Edges. I'm your host, Camilla, and today, let's talk shallan. So, last time we were here, I began our conversation on The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, which is his first novel in his Stormlight Archive series, which is like his opus series. It's the one that he's been researching for the longest and that he's finally putting out into the world. He's up to, I believe, novel 4 or 5 right now, but I just recently read the first one, so we're going to start there. Now, in this series that I like to call Character Talk, we discuss prominent characters from my favorite novels and their context in the plot and just discuss them in general. So last time we talked about Kaladin and Dalinar, which are two of the what I consider to be the main characters of the series. Today we're going to be talking about Shallan, who's the other main character, and Adolin, who is Dalinar's son. We're also going to be talking about a lot of the smaller supporting characters that I feel had an impactful role on the plot in this novel. Alright, so to begin our discussion of these characters, I thought we would start with Shallan, but in order to do so, since she is one of the very few main woman characters in this novel, I feel like we have to address the role of women and the gender roles in this world. So I'm going to start by talking about what is expected of women and men in Alethkar specifically. So I'm not going to talk about it as a whole in the whole universe in which this takes place, because Brandon Sanderson makes it very clear that his cast of characters is diverse, that the world that he has built is not based on Alethi principles, which is the country that obviously this war is taking place in. There are a lot of people, especially you see this kind of shine through in the Bridge Cruise, where you see people from a lot of different cultures, and through the interludes as well, you kind of become more familiar with the fact that this world has a lot more scope to it than just Alethi modesty, you know? Like, especially, even within the book itself, people who follow the Vorin religion and Alethi people are known to be as, like, prudes in the eyes of the rest of the world. So this is not a representation of the gender roles that exist in the world as a whole, because that's not really a thing. It just varies from country to country. But specifically in Alethkar, which, let me make that clear, is not the same country as Shallan is from. Shallan's actually from Jakaved, which I don't think I'm saying that right, but basically her heritage is Vedin, which is a different culture entirely, but they fall under the same religion, which is Vorinism, which is essentially where their societal structures come from. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that they fall under the same category, which means that they're kind of beholden to the same societal constructs. So the role of women in Alethkar or Jakaved or whatever is they are scholars in this world. They're the only ones that are able to learn how to read. Well, everyone is able to learn how to read, but they're the only ones who is socially acceptable to know how to read, because reading is not seen as masculine. So naturally, women inhabit the roles of scribes, secretaries, and surprisingly as well, like scientists, which makes sense. You see Navani Colin, which is, you know, Dalinar's love interest and also the late wife, or the wife, the ex-wife of the late king, Gavilar, who was executed by the Parshendi, is a she's, I forget the exact term, but she creates fabrils, which, like I explained in the last podcast, is like their form of technology that harnesses stormlight through gemstones. Now, she is more, because of her high birth, Navani is more of a patron. But that doesn't really mean that she isn't involved in the process of making it, and also the people who work under her are women as well. So that kind of makes sense. On the other hand, men are seen as soldiers. Like, they're supposed to take the roles of leadership and soldier, warrior roles, and also other, like, masculine arts that are seen as more fitting of men. In addition, women are expected to cover their safe hand, which in this universe is their left hand. Now, it's not really made clear whether their left hand is their safe hand because it's non-dominant, and if left-handed women have their right hand covered, but I think that's just like an interesting little detail that is not really made clear. However, it is of note that this safe hand has different levels of like modesty required. Like highborn women will often cover it entirely with a sleeve and have a pouch within it that is actually very relevant to Shallan's story because she stores the broken soul caster within her safe pouch, which is seen improper for anyone else to touch because it's essentially like another area of privacy. However, more dark-eyed women who are like of lesser station often wear a glove over their safe hand, which is seen as less modest. And you see Shallan kind of struggling with modesty more than almost a lot of the other less savory tasks, but that's just because all these customs are so drilled into her that you see when she even has to put a glove on, it makes her blush because it's seen as very immodest. It's like exposing yourself to a degree that you're not comfortable with. But it is very interesting because others see them as prudes because obviously, like many other countries, they don't have the same customs and they just have both hands out. But it is interesting the levels of modesty that are shown to be acceptable. Also, the foods that women and men eat are different. Now, this is not that important, but it is a cool distinction that is kind of worked in where men are seen eating more savory and spicy foods, whereas women are expected to eat things that are sweeter. And this applies to like meals as well, where they have different dishes that are served for men and women. So these are just some of the distinctions that are important culturally for Vorin people and for like Alethi and Vedin people that Shallan is beholden to, and it kind of puts into context the gendered situation in this world. Anyways, there's definitely a bunch of reasons why I find Shallan's character interesting. I think that more than anything, she has a unique situation where her life's not immediately in danger, but she definitely does have an intrinsic motivation that is high stakes for her. And you really see her in a completely alien environment to her. Like she's doing things that she is definitely not used to before, and it's very implied that this is very different than what her life was like before, although we don't really know the true nature of that until well into the second book, so that's not something that is really necessary context for the first book. But I really liked her dynamic with people, and I think that's a very interesting contrast to the way that between the ways that Shallan interacts with other people and like Kaladin interacts with other people, and obviously Dalinar as well, but he has a very different dynamic where Dalinar is kind of the high prince, obviously, so people he speaks to are either his family or his inferiors. And Kaladin, well, he's taken on this leadership role among the Bridgemen, and like I mentioned in the previous episode, he's not the most like amiable person. He has a very like standoffish personality, which is obviously a direct result of his situation and kind of the stakes that he's always surrounded by. His life is always at risk, and he's understandably pretty depressed about it. But Shallan does not have that same depression to her, regardless of an arguably similarly tragic backstory. But she has this confidence to her that, although obviously is out of her comfort zone for her to be confident in herself, when she talks to the sailors, obviously, like, it's when we are introduced to her, it's already been established that she's been at sea with these sailors for a while. So her personality has had that chance to develop from the young girl that's naive that it was and sheltered that it was implied that she was. And so we see her having done that personality development off screen, or like before the words of this book. So we're introduced to her in as a witty character, as someone who, now that she has free reign to say whatever she wants, takes that opportunity to engage in banter and just be this really interesting character to read. And I honestly enjoyed that. I like the way she has a different dynamic with the people she meets and how she's adaptable. I really like that her character is adaptable, no matter her faults. Obviously, she has faults. I think what she's setting out to do in the first place is crazy. And it really, like, this whole idea of the theft, that she's trying to steal something, from a mentor that, even from the beginning, even when you don't really have any idea who or what Jasna Colin actually is, you already kind of like her. Like, she's an interesting character. She's out of the scope of what the Alethi are so proper, and they feel like women need to be a certain way and men need to be a certain way. Now, Jasna has completely flipped that. Like, she obviously still holds to propriety, and she's obviously a light-eyed, so she holds to that aspect of her role. But she's also very kind of rebellious in that sense. Like, she's labeled as a heretic. She obviously doesn't believe in Vorinism, which is like the major religion in everyone's lives that kind of propriety is modeled after. So she's obviously introduced to the reader as an interesting character. Like, I don't think at one point in this novel you think, while she is cold, like, maybe you don't warm up to her as a reader right off the bat, but you know that she has an interesting part to play, and she just is set up to be engaging. So naturally what Shallan is trying to do feels wrong to the reader. Like, you want her to succeed, and at times I feel like when she's close to achieving her goal, you really want to be like, go one way or the other. Like, you want to root for her. You want to say, just like, I personally was frustrated with her. I thought, just get it over with. Like, your guilty conscience, if you're gonna do it, then do it. But if you're not, then back off, because you have a whole life. Like, it's not worth risking. So in that sense, there's kind of an intrinsic conflict within the reader to either just do it and get it over with and stop, like, being scared about it, or just wanting her to not go through it, because she has this whole life that she set up for herself, and that's ultimately way more interesting than going back to her house back in Jacobed that we know nothing about. Anyway, I feel like that's kind of what makes it interesting, because there's just, you never know what you actually want Shallan to do until she's actually doing it, and then you kind of have to make a decision. And I think at very few points in the story do you feel really conflicted like that, where you're not sure if you want the character to succeed, which I feel like is a feeling that has recurred, and obviously sometimes as a reader you're forced to make a decision as to what do you really want to support. But I think in Shallan's character, this feeling shows up the most often, which is why I'm so intrigued and, like, into her character arc. Because even in the second book, I don't really want to drag the second book too much into this, but she has to make a lot of decisions concerning who she wants to trust and what part she wants to play now that she's kind of free of any other obligations. Or when she has obligations, she also has a bunch of other things that she's doing that subvert expectations completely. But I feel like you don't see this much with any other character, as I was saying. Like, with Kaladin, you kind of know that you always want him to be a champion for the Bridgemen and lift them up and ultimately realize his destiny of being able to use Stormlight and being a Surgebinder and all that. And you kind of understand that. But with Shallan, she just is. Like, she has obviously a role to play, but that role is more ambiguous because, spoiler, but eventually, like, she decides to become a scholar, and she really fights for that. Once she makes that decision, she messes up big time in this book. Like, that's another thing as well. After you get past that reader conflict, it just kind of all unfolds, and it's not exactly what you would expect. Like, it's not as straightforward as I think some of the other arcs are. The climax of Shallan's arc, others might have thought it to be a little bit boring, because I understand that reading her chapters is not reading a ton of action. It's reading a lot of scholarly nuance. Like, it's just her interactions with Jasna and her, like, discovering a new world of scholarship. And scholarship is not that interesting to that many people. It's not action scenes where her life is at stake, but she's also working towards a goal that is meant to make the reader uneasy, like stealing something of such importance between someone that the reader has seen Shallan and Jasna make that bond. So obviously that theft is going to make the reader uneasy. So I think there's something to that, and that's why it kept me engaged rather than just another action scene. So by the time the climax of Shallan's arc came around, I was invested and I wanted to see what would happen. And I think the slow integration of the powers into Shallan's arc was actually way more interesting to me than Kaladin's revelation. Not because I didn't think it was well done or not interesting, but I really enjoyed the like pattern creatures making their way into her drawings and her just being really on edge about that, and then all of a sudden at the point where she was at her lowest, when she was caught and when everyone just was against her, she managed to soul cast, and she was just thrown into this dangerous situation where for once her life was actually at stake. When she went into Shadesmar, her life was at stake because she could have very well been drowned in that ocean of spheres because she had no idea. And at that point, there's no dramatic irony either. The reader has no idea what Shallan is getting herself into. You know, she's just falling into this completely different dimension that we don't get clarity on until we realize that Jasna knows what's going on and can actually provide some explanation as a different kind of mentor to Shallan, a mentor of like surge binding. And so that revelation of not only Shallan being put in that dangerous situation and being turned on by everyone around her because of her own actions that we all knew were happening, but we didn't really realize the scope of the consequences. And that paired with her like romance arc, which I thought was, I didn't think it was bad. I thought it was a little bit refreshing, but it didn't seem like it was going to last. So I think in that sense, it just made sense the way that Capsule played into it. But I didn't think it was a bad addition. Like, I feel like people might not think that romance was the best suited, but I thought it was a good way to kind of make everything play together in Shallan's arc because it was kind of natural for Shallan to have a love interest. With the way that her personality was set up, it makes sense for her to be drawn to that kind of thing. So I thought it was a choice that made sense for her character specifically. Like, if it was someone else, I don't think it would have made as much sense. But for her to be drawn to someone, she's drawn to powerful people, to people who have charisma, because her herself, she's witty, she likes to engage in people like that. And since she was sheltered before, it makes sense for her to kind of want attention from other people. So in that sense, the romantic plot made sense to me, and was like dramatic. It played out, and when he turned on her too, it was just like the stakes were high for Shallan. So that kind of compounded that. And honestly, it did feel hopeless. Like, Brandon Sanderson did a good job at the climax of Shallan's arc of making her feel hopeless, despite her stakes being arguably lower than like Kaladin's, you know? But she could have lost her life at multiple points. But actually, the interesting thing is not that she could have died. It's more that she could have lost everything. Like, to her, death was not the most important thing that she could lose. Does that make sense? Like, in a sense, Shallan's arc was so impactful because her death was not the thing that could have provided the reader with the most despair. Her stakes were beyond just her own personal self. It was her ambition for scholarship. She could have lost her ability to have a future, and she could have just gone back to the way she was before, where she was complacent and quiet and not having an out to this confined life she was living. And in addition to that, back home, her family, her house would be completely just destitute. Like, that was the larger scope of her stakes. Like, it wasn't just about her. In addition, Jasna Colin would probably have been upset and would have never taken another ward again. And she would have felt betrayed. So in that sense, like, the reader's already invested in Jasna's feelings at this point too. And you can feel the betrayal and how it impacts both of them. So the stakes are very high. And you also realize that, like, Shallan is now a surge binder and that she can soulcast on her own. And that's another big revelation that she stands to lose. And she stands to lose the ability the knowledge to know how to harness her powers, either if she were to die or if Jasna were to disown her. So in that sense, Shallan's stakes are greater than just her, and that's what makes her very interesting. In addition to her personality, which I think is like a breath of fresh air in comparison to some of the other characters. And I think it's very needed as well. I think her personality did a really good job of playing with playing in tandem with Jasna's personality to make their chapters very readable. And that's what I liked about it. So, yeah, I thought Shallan's arc was pretty good, pretty great. Um, and she learned a lot of lessons, which sets her up to be a more major character in the second book, which really, I think, was the keystone there. Because Kaladin also plays a very large part in the second book, and I think just in general, all of their stories are more intertwined. But without the first book's setup, Shallan would not be as interesting of a character, I think. And the first book was done very well. Like, for all the reasons I explained, her personality, the stakes of her situation, how it all played out just in general, the revelations of her powers, the revelations about, like, the world that we get to see through her eyes. Her drawings too are very interesting, like especially because it's kind of a mixed media piece of art. Like it is mostly a book, but we see like art play a role throughout it as well, and symbolism. So that mostly shines through Shallan's chapters. And it just really sets her up to be a more major character in the second book, and a major character that you don't feel bad about following. That you spend a lot of time with her in the second book, and I actually enjoyed it. Like, you don't feel like it's a drag to just have chapter upon chapter of her own personal journey away from the main hubbub of the war camps and the war conflict. And I don't know if I've talked a lot about her in this episode. I know I have, but I definitely have a lot more to say about her, like, story-wise for the second book. But I'll just leave it at that for now because I think it was pretty well done, her arc, and I enjoyed it. I think justice for Shallan. I don't really know much about like what other people think about her, but if someone thinks she's boring, I beg to differ. I think it was actually a breath of fresh air to not have her on the brink of dying, but for her to have like larger stakes. Because the worst thing that can happen is not always death for a character. It's disownment, exile, like all those kinds of things are very important because in their world, reputation is important, and the way that the characters play roles with other characters and their actions can have really great consequences. And Jasna is an important character, and she's connected. She's basically Shallan's only connection to the war camps and to the other characters in this novel, to Kaladin and Dalinar and Adolin and all that. So if she were to have lost that connection, then there would be no story. So I think that the stakes of that really justify the lull in action. And I don't see a problem with that. I don't think these fantasy novels need to be all action all the time. Like, I don't think that's what we sign up for when it's not an action novel. It's not a Marvel movie where it's half action. It's plot, it's exposition, and having a more nuanced character like Shallan is important for that as well. And she's also naive. She's not perfect. She's like a child. So I think that's refreshing as well, because she's frustrating too at times, but I won't get too much into that because I think that's just a personal thing. Like, obviously, when you see some of her decisions, you're like, dang, but she's a teenager. They're all just children, so. Anyway, so let's move on in our discussion to some of the smaller characters and some that are not so small, but I think just have a smaller role in the actual like screen time that they get. I think we should start by talking about Adolin, because Adolin does have a connection to Shallan that's pretty strong in the second book, and so their characters are kind of intertwined, and it was kind of just a coincidence that I decided to talk about them side by side like this, but I think now that I've read more of the second book, it just makes natural sense. But Adolin, in a sense, Adolin is Dalinar's eldest son. He is the son that is a dueling champion. He is kind of rebellious against Dalinar's more stoic, very code-centric mentality. He is the one who loves his father unconditionally and believes him to be a great warrior, but is also one of his biggest skeptics at some point, which I think makes his loyalty more poignant. Which is the point I'm going to make, that Adolin is important because he serves as Dalinar's natural heir. He is the natural warrior, natural-born warrior, has a full set of shard plate, is loyal to his father to no end, but is also willing to be skeptical of Dalinar and kind of be the greatest pushback against Dalinar that also will eventually make him his father's greatest ally, because he could have taken over and Dalinar's responsibilities and been a high prince when Adolin himself thought that Dalinar was going insane. So the fact that he eventually accepted Dalinar's visions was incredibly important for their relationship and for Dalinar just having allies in general at the war camps, because Adolin was a greatly respected, the ideal image of a young Alethi man who, or like youth, obviously, like he's still like a he's a young adult. He has a lot of girlfriends. He like is kind of a player, but he's also like that more playful foil to Dalinar's character, and they have a lot of push and pull, but it's important because in the end their allyship is what actually makes a lot of the plot move forward. I'd say like mentally he's not the most like intelligent or scheming character. Like, you're not going to see him at the orchestrating the center of extravagant like subplots of like plans, but he definitely like is a willing participant of those plans. Does that make sense? Like, he doesn't construct the plans, but he's also not inept. He plays his part well, and he also takes initiative to be a leader and to make decisions sometimes. And yeah, he's not a stupid character by any means, which I think makes him interesting. Like, he's kind of an airhead, kind of player, kind of like that like frat boy type of character, but just more mature than he seems, in a sense. Like, he does have that aspect of emotional maturity that is absent often in like player type characters, that makes the distinction between someone who is just kind of a placeholder and someone who's just all bravado, all talent on the battlefield, and no tact. But Adolin does have that tact, which I think is really important for making him a character that is not incredibly insufferable to read. Like, to Kaladin, he's insufferable. To Kaladin hates him. But later, Adolin proves that he is not deserving of that disdain. Like, he is different than other Light Eyes, which Kaladin eventually comes to acknowledge, which, sorry for the second book, spoilers, I guess, but Kaladin comes to acknowledge and respect Adolin to an extent. Like, it's more of a camaraderie, because they realize, like, despite Adolin's player and frivolous tendencies, he does have that role to play, and he plays it well. He has rational thought, he has tact, and you know, like, he's enjoyable to read because he is a social person. I don't think much more has to be said about Adolin in terms of Way of Kings specifically. I think that he has a lot more of a bigger and more profound role in Words of Radiance, and I think he's just a more exciting character to read in that book, but that's mostly due to his relationship with Shallan, I have to say. Like, I think that both of them together have a good banter, and they just have a good feeling about them as characters that are compatible. But just him alone in the first book, obviously his major plot points, his major role in the first book is just to be skeptical of Dalinar, then to eventually come to accept him, and to profoundly and deeply hate Sadeas after his betrayal at the Battle of the Tower. That is a big thing. Mostly, I mean, I don't know that his hatred of Sadeas specifically is super important to the story, but it also shows that Adolin recognizes that his father is not at fault, and that Sadeas is just someone who is conniving, and it's basically the end of any pretense that Sadeas was still their ally. And Adolin doesn't have anything that ties him to Sadeas. Like, he was the one who advised Dalinar against him. But Dalinar, how could Dalinar know? Because even though he now knows that the visions that he's having are recordings and pre-recorded, and that the answer to his question, should he trust Sadeas, was not, it was misleading, but if it was pre-recorded, how would they know, right? Or maybe they do, because it's the Almighty, and that's still not clear, so forgive me. But what I'm trying to say is that Adolin doesn't have any underlying, like, leftover loyalties to Sadeas that Dalinar does. That Dalinar and Sadeas were strong allies, united under Gavilar, but now that Gavilar's dead, and it's only his kind of Oh my gosh, the king is so infuriating. I hate Elkhokar so much. He's so annoying. He's a brat. That's what he is. More so than Adolin, more so than any other frat boy player character, Elkhokar is just a brat and so annoying. Anyway, he gets in the way. I don't really wish him dead. I don't know if that's gonna happen in Words of Radiance. I don't really know. But just for what it is, he's paranoid, he's annoying, he doesn't actually have any power, he makes poor decisions that put the actual important characters into jeopardy, whatever. There has to be an incompetent king who's kind of a spoiled brat. It just makes sense. But it is still infuriating. But I think that also is like a good contrast to Adolin, because Adolin can also be infuriating. He can be like, but it's more of a playfully infuriating kind of way. He just is that way. He's just kind of like a player. He's just a guy, but Elkhokar is like incompetent in a sense. So there's a difference there. Anyway, all that being said, there's not much to Adolin in this book, but I still thought he was worth mentioning because, it's a good setup for the second book where he does get some meat to his character. All right, let's talk about the fun stuff. Let's talk about the smaller characters that mean nothing or everything to the story, that are just thrown into the interludes. They just have random here or there perspective shifts to their favor that are just like ultimately either the most interesting parts of this book or the least. And it kind of goes both ways. To me, for example, Renarin, he doesn't really have a point of view. He's Adolin's younger brother, but in my heart of hearts, I feel that he has a bigger role. I feel it. But even through the second book, he doesn't have a bigger role. So I don't know what to tell you. Like, I thought something would change in Renarin, or we would have some sort of like character development that would make him more interesting. And, spoiler, but he does like take the initiative to try to become a better warrior and join Bridge 4, and he shows work ethic, and he has so much potential, which is why I thought, by this point he would at least have something of interest to him, but he's just kind of a little bit of dead weight right now as a character. I don't fault him for that. Like, obviously he's just physically challenged, but that doesn't really have anything to do with being an interesting character, in my opinion. You can, there's so many examples. Like Lopin, he has one arm, but he is interesting. He has personality. But Renarin, I really haven't seen him show that personality, show that gumption that I look for in any supporting character that I actually want to root for. Anyway, he's more of an afterthought because I really thought he would have a role by now, but I'm still holding out. Maybe he will be important. I don't know. Maybe he'll do something. Don't spoil it for me, that's for sure. I'm doing my best to avoid spoilers out here. Anyway, so yeah. More interestingly, in my opinion, is Wit. No idea what to make of him. He seems to have his claws in everything. And he's just the most interesting kind of character because he's like borderline omniscient. Like, he doesn't know everything, but he gives you the impression that he totally could. Like, he really totally could have powers. And I say powers, I don't mean surge bindings. Like, I don't think he might be a radiant, but like, I don't think he is that same kind of breed of powers as Kaladin or Shallan. But I feel like he is just like mystical in a sense that none of the others are. He has this aura about him that Brandon Sanderson implies he's important. He is important. He was Sigzil's mentor, whatever that means. Like, he was a... And I'm not too well versed. I know that there's a part... Brandon Sanderson has his universe, which is the Cosmere, and there are characters that he puts into his books that can, like, jump around the different dimensions and stuff. This is what I know from the very little that I know of the workings of his universe. Like, I didn't quite get to finish Warbreaker, which I feel like had, like, it was a standalone novel that, from what I've heard, has more of an explanation of that kind of thing, but I haven't gotten around to it. So don't clown on me for not knowing that, but I feel like there's more to Wit, and he's just interesting every time he pops up, and then he'll just not pop up in the story for like pages, for hundreds and hundreds of pages, and then he'll come back, and then he'll provide some important character development for Kaladin, and then off he'll go, or he'll just like do something that you think is going to be super important, and then maybe he's not, maybe it is. He just knows more than he lets on, and that is just so frustratingly perfect of a character that I still smile whenever he's on screen, like he steals the show every time, and he's just made out to be a minor character. I don't know. He has greater significance, mark my words. And I don't know, I just really like jester characters. Like, I like characters that have fun with their dialogue, that aren't just set in one way of personality, that are erratic. Like, I enjoy that kind of character, but it has to be done really well. And I think Wit is more so because you don't know that he's just like, you don't think he's just a joker. You never think like, oh, Wit, he's just an arbitrary character that knows nothing more than these characters do. He definitely knows more. And he's also just funny, and whenever he's on screen, whenever he's in the story, I am invested. And sometimes when it's getting a little bit boring or like there's a lull, Wit will be there and I'll be like, yes, something new to this situation. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Wit. I genuinely don't know what to make of him in the greater context of the story, but he was just like, he was interesting. I didn't think that him instigating the courtesans was his actual goal at any point. So it leaves me wanting to know like what his actual motivation for being there was. And at the end of the day, it really could just be he was there to do his job, but I don't think it is. So I thought he was one of the more interesting minor characters. I think to close this out, I'm going to talk about Seth, or Seth Sun Vayano, the assassin in white, if you will. The guy who started this all, and honestly, it's a little bit silly, like he's just kind of silly. I think that obviously he's overpowered, like he's the first surge binder we're introduced to in this world, and his only reason for killing is when we're in his point of view, we see his moral conflict. Initially we see his conflict while he's killing King Gavilar. We see, oh, I can't walk on stone, it's unholy. Fine. So you see that he clearly has morals, and he's tied up with this situation where he was named Truthless, which I deduced this pretty early on, but I figured like he's Shin, right? So according to their customs, he probably told this big lie, or alleged lie, that they deemed grave enough to assign him to this fate of being truthless and bound to an oath stone where whoever possessed it was his master and could tell him to do whatever, So to me, that's just the making of an overpowered character, and one that's really interesting because he's not the villain of this story. There is no real villain, which is interesting too, I think. But the characters think him to be the main villain. Like, he's the reason for their conflict. He's the reason for a lot of the problems in the world currently. And he is still at large. And yet, when we're in his perspective, it just seems just so trivial. Like, for him, he is unable to take his own life because he holds to an oath, but he desperately wants to die. He doesn't want to kill these innocent people, but he has to because his Oathstone master makes him. And the reason he's interesting is because of how much you see the rules of the world apply to him. Like, from what we know, more or less, the Oathstone itself doesn't actually control him. Like, if someone told him to lift his arm, the reason that he does it is because he's obligated to, not because it has some mystical power over his arm. So I think that shows just how much that if he wanted to rebel, he could. He could damn his soul forever, or according to what he believes. But he could prevent that killing. But in his mind, it's so ingrained that he has to because he's truthless, and that Oathstone is an oath that he cannot break, that it leads him to commit reprehensible acts that literally throw off the entire world and could doom the entire world and have much larger repercussions upon more people than he could ever imagine. And at the price of his own life, he could just end that killing, end that slaughter, and fix a lot of the problems. And yet, he doesn't, because he says he's bound to this oath. And it kind of shows that he's human. We can see his inner monologue. We know that he has a moral compass. We know that he can think for himself. But he's so lost in feeling sorry for himself and feeling hopeless that his killings are unpreventable because he's truthless and he has to do it. He has a moral right. He can't take his own life because he's bound by this oath. And yet, it shows the fact that he's unwilling to even think in that direction, think outside the box, think like that, and sacrifice his own soul to prevent the killing and to prevent things that he knows are wrong, because we know that he knows that they're wrong, shows that he is human, that he's selfish, that he has thought, and that thought leads him to make decisions based on, obviously, like, it's custom. It is enforced, but it's not enforced tightly enough that he couldn't take action against it, but he refuses to. And I think when an important revelation is made in the second book about the nature of, how he became truthless, and that just absolute devastation that Seth feels, it's this whole, like, preventability and accountability thing comes into play, and you realize that he has free will, he has free thinking, and the thing that makes him interesting is his ability to realize that what he's doing is wrong, and his just absolute inability to do anything about it. I mean, technically he has the ability, is the point I'm trying to make. Like, he has the ability to do something about it, but because the rules of his world apply to him, the social, like, constraints drilled into him by his own society somehow just constrict his free thinking, so that he's unable to contemplate doing something for the greater good rather than doing something to uphold his one selfish oath, in a sense. I don't know. Anyway, so the major thing about Seth is, I think, the fact that he is just such a dramatic and important character in everyone else's life, but to him, he's just an insignificant character, if that makes sense. Like, the dichotomy and the juxtaposition of how the entirety of Roshar is affected by his actions and how it affects him personally is just so vastly different. And so, like, I'll be honest, it just gives me whiplash, the fact that he is just so self-pitying and self-destructive and is unable to do anything about it, or he thinks he's unable to do anything about it. I don't know. It doesn't make for a very pleasant character, in my opinion. There's nothing special about his personality. It doesn't attract the reader. It doesn't draw the reader in. There's no nuance to what's going on inside his head. I don't think he's particularly special in that sense, which makes it more, I guess, ridiculous and funny to me that he is just so important in everyone else's lives. I think he's worth mentioning. I really do. He's like a big conflict in this story. It's funny to me, and I thought it was worth highlighting how important he is and how insignificant he is at the same time. Okay, I'm definitely running the risk of dragging this out for too long because there's so many interesting and important and nitty-gritty little details in this book that just make me want to gush about it all day. But I do realize that there's kind of a point where you have to draw the line. You can't talk about everything. And also, some storylines he just seems to kind of drop for the time being, at least, I hope, at least for the time being. Like, the part about the Pure Lake, there was, like, just a completely different, I mean, it's an introduction to a completely new setting, which I really enjoyed, but I just get invested in the little stories, and then when we don't revisit it for, like, thousands of pages, I'm like, where did that go? But honestly, it is just a really great way to diversify the world building, but I would like to eventually see where all of those stories converge and lead, and I'm sure it will happen at one point. But anyways, thank you so much for tuning in again and listening to the second part of my character analysis of the characters and the plot of this great and amazing and long novel. I really hope you enjoyed. I love Brandon Sanderson. I think he does a really wonderful, splendid job of just immersing the reader and just consistently producing incredible novels. So thank you for listening once again. It's always great to have you. I hope you had a really good time listening to my discourse on this, my opinions. And as always, have a lovely next couple of weeks, and I will see you on the next episode. Bye!